The Marathon server slam just ended, and the rhetoric on it seems to be kind of out of control, with some people absolutely hating the pace and friction of the game as an extraction shooter, while others loving the hardcore approach it seems to be taking with its competitive PvP. I put a bunch of time into the server slam over the weekend to try and substantiate as many of the critiques as I can, to give you some honest impressions of the game as well as put the complaints of the game into context within the extraction genre writ large. Turns out, a lot of the criticism, 100% valid and concerning. So sit back, relax, enjoy the video, and most importantly, let me know what you think of Marathon. Do you agree with any of the criticisms floating around the internet? Is there anything you think I missed that you're concerned about with the game as well? Or are you loving it and planning on picking it up anyway? Let me know down below in the comments. So I think the very first thing we should answer is the question everyone is asking, which is Marathon good? Off rip, I'll tell you, the simple answer is yeah, I think it's good. But also, there needs to be an asterisk to it. When I say Marathon is good, what I really mean is, rather, the foundations of it are finally at a place that I would call good. The gunplay obviously remains incredibly satisfying. Bungie knows how to make very cathartic gunplay, both with how the guns sound when you're shooting them, but also, more importantly, how it feels to pull that trigger. The volumetric lighting and reworked environments really helps maps feel atmospheric, though I don't think this element is totally at a place I'd call finalized. And the overall presentation of its lore and meta progression, I think, do a lot of the heavy lifting as an extremely stylized hook. With the sole caveat that this also gives the onboarding an added layer of friction that is debatably pretty risky to do in what is already a niche subgenre. However, I still think there are lots of things that need refinement in the game. Not just quality of life improvements, but general system level tweaks in order for the game to have legs long term and for the appeal it needs as a first party title to broaden just a bit wider. All this to say, I really can't believe the game is already shipping as I think an open beta and not a server slam really would have helped Bungie get this game to where I think it needs to be for a successful launch. Legitimately, it's kind of crazy they're asking for this much feedback the week of launch. Anyway, let's dive in and cover all the details in specific that I think are solid and what still needs some work. I think the thing I first want to talk about is presentation, as I think first impressions go a long way when you boot up the game, and Marathon does a really good job of getting off on the right foot, I think, in this regard. Specifically, I think that comes with the art style. Now, I know a lot of people akin this to something like Roblox, which, sure, I'm not going to debate if you're not into this sort of art style, but for me, I think it really works. Especially in-game, when you're seeing a lot of these like hyper-stylized sci-fi buildings not just look incredibly vibrant, but be so starkly unique from location to location, and sometimes from room to room. It cannot be underestimated just how much additional volumetric lighting and bloom specifically go to help make the world feel all that much more atmospheric. Running through Dire Marsh and seeing the fog roll through the trees goes a long way to help me feel immersed when I'm playing the game. And I think this was very much needed. Sunlux's score, I think, also goes a really long way to help make this game both stand out, but also give a really strong impression. The electronic noise industrial soundtrack, I think, is not just cool in promo materials and YouTube shorts, but can really be leveraged once the game fully releases. Having some of those iconic scores line the main menus while in between raids and sorting through your vaults and kitting up with a strong loadout is going to help keep the energy of the game not just unique, but propulsive. Legit, this will help keep people in the game. Feel goes a long way. And last, I think the mix of the hi-fi setting with lo-fi presentations in the codex and the lore coming to life through faction characters and dialogue, I mean, just watching any of the faction introductions really speaks for itself. There is a strong presence of identity here that is really great to watch in motion. However, all of these strengths are not without some really blatant weaknesses. Here, we've got to talk about UI. I've seen a lot of complaints that the UI in this game is really not good and is a big reason why it makes getting into the game a lot harder than it needs to be. I will not push back on this entirely. Instead, I will add, it is not specifically a UI problem that Marathon has, but rather a UX problem that is creating a lot of these issues. And when I say UX, I mean going through the UI is not intuitive. Many of the mechanics of menu maneuverability are extremely cumbersome. And most importantly, there is a lack of clear readability of critical information when sorting through many of these menus. Let me give you some examples. The first one that comes to mind is inventory. Whether you're on PC or on console, I think there are too many different buttons for equipping things, placing things in your backpack, and offloading, which makes for a cumbersome experience. It already on console does not feel good to be dragging and dropping items from one side of the screen to the other. And it does not feel intuitive to have to hold and click for about 3 seconds to install various mods. And speaking of mods, there is a fundamental difference right now between dragging and dropping from your vault into a weapon mod and dragging and dropping from gun to gun. What I mean by this is, if I have a chip mod on a gun and I want to drag and drop this onto my secondary gun, you cannot do this. You must unequip that mod. It will then go into your vault. You will have to sort through your vault, look for that mod, then you will have to drag and drop onto the gun that you want. That is not intuitive. The counter argument for this is that you can go into your secondary weapon, inspect that weapon, then equip mods from that gun inspect. Now, this is easier to efficiently look at what mods are available to equip on said weapon. However, maneuvering through multiple menus just to equip mods, again, is rather cumbersome. And I think here's the most important thing that I'm really concerned about. And again, that is clear readability of critical information. Build crafting is a huge part of how this game wants you to play. This is done both through cores and implants. Cores affect your character's abilities, and implants affect your character's stats. There are 3 different kinds of implants you can place on a character: a head implant, a torso implant, and a leg implant. Readability for differentiating different kinds of implants while in raid is, for me, entirely illegible. At a glance, you cannot differentiate what said implant does. All you have is the icon, which is made redundant by the PNG of the actual item. In order to find out what said implant does, you must hover over and wait for the item description box to fade in. Only then can you read that the implant is titled something like Strike Kit, or Helping Hands, or Sprint Kit. This is only half the problem, as you must memorize what effect this has on your character's stats. The added complexity is that different implants have different roles on them, which are the perks that will affect how you play. Being able to differentiate different types of implants within the same rarity is just not at a place I would call anywhere close to intuitive, as you do not have the time in raid to quickly process what I would call critical information about what you're looting and what you're leaving behind. And if the answer is, well, this creates tension because the longer you're left reading implants from a downed runner, you may get downed from another player. To which I would argue, waiting to read paragraph descriptions of items is not tense, but cumbersome. As I think the real tension in an extraction shooter is being able to immediately recognize what items are and whether or not you have the stash base to take said items, not figuring out what said item actually is and does. There are also added problems like cursor speed settings for console players, the ability to compare items, which I cannot believe exists, as, again, Bungie wants this to be sort of a build crafting game. Therefore, you should be able to compare either guns, cores specifically, and implants as well, and see how that affects your character's stats. All of these things make for a cumbersome UX experience, which I'm realizing is redundant. X stands for experience. But anyway, the UI is also a bit of an issue. Now, again, the good news is Bungie say they're listening to feedback, but again, these are the kinds of things you take note of seriously during alpha and beta testing, and not the week of launch. Some additional notes I think for UI improvements are things like the compass providing more information than what it currently does, which is just direction. The icons above your teammates being dynamic when in fight, I think adds a layer of visual confusion. I do not need for my teammate to have an exclamation point above his head if he's getting shot at. The icons of guns equipped, I think right now, are completely illegible considering the design of them are all rectangular. And I think it's bizarre that the name of the gun that you currently have equipped is not added to alleviate some of that confusion. Currently, maps cannot be previewed while not in raid, which you should be able to do. And speaking of maps, there is way too much negative space on the map screen while in raid. I do not understand why the map takes up only a third of the screen space. You can overlay the legend in the corner of the map with a toggle on and off. I also think you should let us zoom and scroll the map while in the map screen for clear, more distinct pings of where to go. And the last thing I'll mention in this video is that there straight up needs to be better differentiation between health and shield items. Not just shape, but color, as both patch kits and shield kits are both comprised of color combinations of red, white, and black. Now, I'm not covering over everything, but it's a combination of all of these bespoke pieces of the UI and the UX not feeling intuitive that I think is the biggest detriment to the overall feel of the game. Half the gameplay in extraction shooters is the inventory management, and if that doesn't feel good, then you've already lost half the battle. Right, let's talk gameplay, because I think this is where Marathon is really succeeding, but could use just a couple of tiny tweaks to really make the game on a raid-to-raid basis feel not just immersive, but highly engaging. I like that the game is taking a bit more of a hardcore approach. It is much closer in that regard to being an extraction shooter like Tarkov than it is something like Ark Raiders. With the TTK being as high as it is, it means there's a strong onus on competency in cooperative, competitive team play. This is exactly what you want if your shooter revolves around individual characters and abilities. And what I mean by this is, engaging in PvP fights really encourages you to have a fundamental understanding of how to best leverage your abilities to get the legs up in battle and effectively wipe out enemy opponents. This part of the game feels extremely rewarding. There's a small caveat which I'll get to in just a minute. The downside of these engagements are the actual maps. Let me talk Ark Raiders here for just a minute to try and situate where I'm trying to get at with my problem with the maps in Marathon right now. The maps in Ark Raiders do a really good job at conveying not just atmosphere, but readable information to you as the player at any given moment. The maps aren't just big, they're sprawling. You can see POIs from out in the distance. You can see enemy AI circling said POIs. Downed raiders shoot up raider flares, giving you information about where player density is currently happening. And map conditions serve to differentiate the gameplay of a map on a raid-to-raid basis. In contrast, both Perimeter and Dire Marsh feel extremely isolated in that regard. Map size isn't just intimate, but POIs are obstructed. I do not have much information about the raid at any given moment, leading to me maneuvering around the map, feeling sort of isolating. If I am not currently engaged in any PvE or PvP fight, it simply feels like there's nothing going on in the world around me, because I don't have map information. Now, I understand why there isn't a mechanic of the equivalent of a Raider Flare in a game like Marathon. With the TTK being high, and with everyone spawning into a raid at the same time, save for any solo rooks who are scavenging, then approximating how many teams are left in a map might alleviate a bunch of the tension of not knowing if there is another team around the corner. To this, my only counter argument is that having map information available to you via emergent gameplay of enemies arriving or being taken out or hearing gunshots off in the distance or having map events load in more frequently does a lot for building atmosphere and therefore immersing me in the actual gameplay. As of now, I don't feel like map atmosphere is where it needs to be. The other half of this is player density. One of the biggest complaints I saw online was that there was simply not enough teams loading into a single raid for the game to feel engaging. Many players, including myself, would play entire raids without ever running into an enemy team. And I'm not just talking perimeter here, as this is meant to be the beginner map where there's less people and less enemy AI, but even Dire Marsh had several instances where the game just wasn't that exciting. The feedback to Bungie was to add more teams to every raid, or to let teams spawn in mid-raid. The balancing here is going to be really tough, and one that needs to be sorted pretty quickly after launch. Too many teams with high TTK can lead to a frustrating experience where you are rarely extracting with significant loot or quest progress. Too few, and the game is too boring. Last note on this is that Bungie is looking into adding duos as a queue option, but some people are concerned with the game being a bit more niche, this might split the player base a bit too much, leading to more instances of emptier lobbies. Last, I think one of the biggest issues with Marathon in its current state is the actual loot economy. Right now, going into a raid in its current state feels extremely unbalanced, as a backpack filled to near capacity with ammo and heals is necessary to exfiltrate with any net positives, be it by eliminating other squads, completing contracts, or doing any of the in-map events, such as the lockdown event on Dire Marsh. The couple of complaints I've seen are there's not enough ammo or health found in raid to keep you going, the stack sizes for both ammo and health are not big enough, and the depleted shield or patch kits auto-selling on extraction creates problems where you do not have enough heals or the ability to buy heals when going into the next raid. These, I think, are just symptoms of what is the actual cause of the inventory issue. Marathon operates very similar to Tarkov in that different items take up a different amount of slots in your inventory. Tarkov circumnavigates these issues in two different ways. The first is by having a tactical rig on, which eliminates some of the inventory capacity worries by having consumables in a separate tile space. Arc Raiders does this as well by having both a utility bar as well as augments that add separate, unique utility tiles. Tarkov also lets you stick items inside a bag, which can then be placed inside a backpack, essentially letting you add a couple of inventory slots by having a bag inside of a bag. This no longer works infinitely, but it is a logical way to have some extra space. The only sort of utility tiles that Marathon has is entirely around build crafting. Shields, cores, implants, and one throwable are the only things not going into a tile space in your backpack. That means having stacks of heals eats up a lot of your looting space. There are also different consumables, such as mechanics kits, that I think are essential to surviving a lot of the PvE and PvP fights. Legitimately, I think by simply adding some sort of equivalent of a tactical rig meant for consumables would alleviate so much of the inventory anxiety and would allow you to exfiltrate with more items either to barter with traders or to turn in for faction upgrades. I really think this would go a long way to help the meta progression of the game. And my last note on gunplay is entirely on PvE, which I think is just straight up not fun, as a majority of the encounters essentially boil down to mindlessly shooting ads, with the sole caveat of taking down boss UESC does largely benefit you with some higher rarity gear. The problem is that engaging with these AI just boils down to aiming and shooting with no real thought. This is where I think Arc Raiders really benefited from being developed as a PvE game first, is that in that game, you get a lot of unique ways to engage or not engage with the enemy AI, as fighting different Arc requires different approaches. From what we've seen so far out of Marathon, PvE fights are just a weaker version of PvP battles that, the majority of the time, serves to simply drain your inventory of heals and ammo. Yes, it's good that the AI hits hard, as it keeps navigating POIs tense, but right now there just isn't any real hook to fighting them other than a couple of the stronger UESC. Oh my gosh, and how could I forget keybinds? There's no way to unbind certain keybinds, and I really can't believe there's no toggle option for proximity chat. Everyone wanted proximity chat in this game. They add it, and then no one is prox chatting because you have to push and hold to talk. I'm not going to be doing that mid-fight. If I could toggle it on, I might. And my last note here is on progression, which really I think is going to get its own video, because I think this is one of the strongest aspects of Marathon in its current state. Tying your meta progression of shell upgrades, as well as the inventory of items the traders sell in the armory, into faction progression via contracts is a really great way to tie all these aspects of the game together and incentivize me to approach the game on a raid-to-raid basis in different ways depending on which faction I am currently doing a contract for. It is incredibly refreshing to see a contract like Arachnes, where I must eliminate 3 runners in a single run without dying, be the requisite to unlock better upgrades for my shell, as well as grant me access to better starting gear via the armory. My only complaint here is how much Scrappy in Arc Raiders is underestimated as the GOAT to get you quicker into gameplay. As it stands, in Marathon, bartering for items, even with a couple of faction upgrades to make things both cheaper and sometimes free, still feels kind of imbalanced, as there is no way to streamline acquiring the items needed to barter for basic patch kits and shield recharges. I understand this is where Rook comes into play, where you must scavenge for basic materials, but really all I've learned is that having a mechanic like Scrappy goes a long way to trim a bunch of the fat to get me back into the real part of the game a lot faster. So, is Marathon doing enough to dethrone Arc Raiders? Clearly the answer is no, as if the server slam taught us anything, it's that the current state of Marathon is extremely divisive. Additionally, the setting and onboarding of Arc Raiders is just going to be a lot more approachable than anything Marathon is doing, as Marathon isn't just a harder game to play, as it shines best with 3 people, but it's just harder to learn, as the alien sci-fi setting means you're learning a lot of proper nouns that, conversely, the vast majority of items in Arc Raiders simply just doesn't have. That's not to say Arc Raiders is for casuals and Marathon is for hardcore players. That's not the case. But that less friction does, I think, lead to more people understanding the fundamentals of the game a lot quicker, and therefore are less likely to bounce off of the game in the short and long term. The skill floor of understanding Marathon is just a lot higher than many people's comfort zones, making it less likely that Marathon will overtake Arc Raiders as the main extraction shooter on the market. The biggest bright side here is that the two, I think, can and will coexist as competitors that will inevitably push each other to make strong appeals for why we should be playing their game. Competition is only going to be healthy for the longevity of the genre as it stands. Let me know what you think of Marathon. Do you agree or disagree with any of the complaints going around? And will you be picking it up when the game launches later this week? That's crazy. Until next time, we'll see you in the next one.
Sorry, Peter was almost dead.